Welcome and good afternoon to this second weekend of programs in the context of 2 or 3 tigers. Grateful that you made it despite the obstacles in the immediate surrounding. I don't know how bad it is still, but it was yesterday and this morning. I'm also happy to welcome our guests for these 2 days. My co-curator Hyunjin Kim for the exhibition 2 or 3 Tigers, the curator of the Misfits exhibition and co-host of this weekend, David T., as well as our guests and speakers, James Scott, Nontawat Numben Chapol, who we will hear later today, and Erin Gleason, Erica Tan, who will talk tomorrow, and Faik Kohiri and Imri Nasution, who will enact a performance by Mark T. tomorrow. I'm also thankful to Jakraval Niltamrong, Ho Tsun-Yen, Ritu Sarin and Tenzing Sonam, as well as Im Hong Song, who allowed us to screen their video and film works in parts or in full as part of this program. So what I will do is I will show you an excerpt of a film first that is some 15 minutes long. It's only half of the film though, by Jakraval Niltaram, called Zero Gravity from 2013. Can we switch off the lights, close the curtain, and switch the screen, please? Here we are.
ทั้งสองเนี่ยเล่นเหมือนกับเด็กเลยถ้าคนอื่นมาเห็นเข้าแล้วมันจะไม่ดี
นะครับมันอีกไกลมากกว่าจะถึงอีกด่านหนึ่งครับ
กว่าจะถึงบ้านต้นยางอะครับ
กว่าจะถึงบ้านต้นยาง
7-8 โลครับ
7-8 โลแล้วทางเป็นอย่างนี้ตลอด
หนักกว่านี้ครับ
หนักกว่านี้อีกใช่ไหม
นี่ไม่ไหวแน่เลย
นี่2 เพลาไหมครับ
ครับ2 เพลาแต่มันรถมันเตี้ย
นี่ก็ไม่แน่ใจนะครับ
อาจจะพอไหวใช่ไหมพี่
อาจจะพอไหวมันจะมีหนักอยู่เนินนึงอ่ะเนินลงจากนี้แล้วก็ขึ้นไปอีกเนินนั้นจะขึ้นไปได้
ก็พ้นแล้วใช่ไหม
เนินนี้ก็ขึ้นได้ครับมันเป็นทางปูนตอนเนิน26ครับทางเนิน26ตอนเนิน26มาจากเรือใด22เรือใด26แจ้งว่า4เขตครับเรือใด2226แจ้งว่า4เขตพระนคร22เดินจาก
ไปหยิบไพ่ผืนหนึ่ง
จากศูนย์ราชนุกูลเรียก VR 154เปลี่ยน
บ้านต้นยางเข้าไปหรือเปล่า
เข้าไปไกล
ก็จะไปไหวแล้วเนี่ยเดี๋ยวมันก็
ไม่ไหวครับพี่ขึ้นไปแล้วลงมาแล้ว
หน้าฝนต้องมาหน้าแล้ง
มันต้องติดโฟ
มันต้องมาโหไม่ได้ฝังโคเวอร์นะโคเวอร์
คือผมจะมาทำพวกสารคดีอะครับพี่เกี่ยวกับกะเหรี่ยงอะครับเกี่ยวกับก็อดอาร์มี่ครับพี่รู้จักไหมครับ
เคยได้ยินข่าวแล้วครับ
อันนี้อย่างเดียวด้วย
ผมก็เป็นก้อนละมี
อ่ะ
จริงเหรอครับ
ชิบหายแล้ว
ชื่อฟัง
จริงป่ะครับพี่
จริงครับ ผมก็เป็นหนึ่งเลยนะ
เฮ้ย
จริงเหรอ
ขี้โม้ผมปะเนี่ย
จริงดิ
โอ้เนี่ย
ผมก็เป็นกะเหรี่ยงคนหนึ่งที่อยู่ในเชื้อสายของคนกลุ่มนั้น
จริงเหรอครับ
เฮ้ย
พี่ก็รู้จักกับจอห์นนี่กับลูเทอร์ครับ
นั่นคือตอนนี้เขาอยู่ที่แต่เหมือนกับว่าเรื่องราวมันจะเงียบหายไปแล้ว
ใช่ครับ คือตอนนี้เขาทำอะไรอยู่พี่ดู
ตอนนี้เราไม่รู้ เพราะว่าเพื่อนฝูงที่อยู่ด้วยกันเนี่ยคือต่างคนต่างแยกย้ายหายหมดคือเราเกิดที่นี่เสร็จแล้วเราก็ไปเรียนที่โรงเรียนตชดเสร็จก็ไปต่อทีละระดับไปไต่จนถึงไปจบแค่ปวสที่เกษตรการแค่นั้นก็กลับมาทำงานที่บ้านตระกูลเราตั้งแต่โน้นก็คือเป็นกะเหรี่ยงคือตั้งแต่เรื่องมันเกิดเนี่ยเราก็ต่างคนต่างก็ไม่ค่อยคุยกับคนฝั่งนู้นเท่าไหร่เพราะว่าคนฝั่งนั้นเขาจะอยู่แบบกลุ่มของเขาเองอะไรเงี้ยเรานับถือเขาเป็นเหมือนกับว่าเขาเป็นนายเราอะ
คือดูนุ่ยอะคือพอคือนุ่ยอะแล้วลูเตอร์เลยแล้วก็คือสปอร์ตเจก็ลูเตอร์ไป
เขาไปตั้งแต่ 2007 เลย
ไอ้คนน้องนี่กลับพม่านี่2005หลังจากนั้น2 ปี
พี่ก็ไป
พี่ก็ไป
สวีเดน
ตอนที่เห็นนี่12-13เองแล้วมั้งมีไม่ค่อยรู้เรื่องยังเล็กอยู่ผมยาว
นี่ฮะกิทอดรู้ป่ะ
Dia kita orang kau naik dia kita lebih ni.
กิทอด
Dah.
ส่วนนั้น
Dah kita lebih ni. Lui.
กิทอด
ความรู้ละกับความตั้งใจนั้นรู้ละอัตราเป็นรู้ละและที่เราที่ต่อให้ที่ละและที่เราต่อให้ที่ละและที่เราต่อให้
Can we have light, please? So Chakraval Nil Tamrong calls this film that you've just seen an excerpt of a documentary, as it also is referred to inside the film. I want to suggest to call this mode of documentary a frontier realism. It's a film, like most of Chakraval's work, that ventures into borderlands where common sense categories are suspended and in this suspension, a different reality and temporality emerges. A borderland of life and death, dream and wakefulness, and between the visible world and invisible forces and spiritualities that shape and traverse the different registers of our experiences. It is the second of a series of 2 films in Nilton Wrong's oeuvre, where he engages with the concept of gravity as such an invisible force. The film takes place in the borderland between Thailand and Burma. Set in Ratchaburi, Zero Gravity follows a man on a journey into the area's recent past. That is this rescue worker you have seen lying on the ground in the last scene. And rescue operations, as I learned in Thailand, are privatized, and they compete over the bodies of injured or dead people in case of incidences and accidents. As a side note, Ratchaburi Hospital was the site of a so-called national incident in the year 2000, when the hospital was occupied and staff taken hostage by the armed Karen guerrillas under the commandment of the God's army from neighboring Burma. The leadership of which was attributed to 2 12-year-old twins, as you have learned from the film. The 10 occupying guerrillas were killed during the intervention of the Thai army. Some scandalously executed on the spot after surrender. This incident had a certain significance in raising public awareness over the situation in Burma and the war fought by the Karen people in its south for a long time. And it was also connected to the insurgency that started around the same time in the south of Thailand. Without going into detail here, and there are people in the audience that know a lot of details around these particular histories. I merely wanted to direct your attention to a detail in the film that embodies, in my eyes, the conception that is put forward here of the frontier as a zone of unruly mediations held in suspense, and that for me is in particularly present in this floating radio walkie-talkie device. The part of the film that you haven't seen becomes ever more surreal as this dead woman ghost reappears, that is also pregnant, so again a kind of contradiction in terms. But I'm not going to narrate that whole part because it's also not quite easy to do so. Later today we will have the chance to listen and watch Nontawat Numben Chapol's screening lecture No Boys Land, which takes us once again into the Thai-Burmese borderlands, which has also served as a refuge for the Shan people fighting for independence after their villages being frequently raided by the Burmese military. No Boys Land is a documentary film that follows a character who loses his family at the age of 18 and joins the Shan state army to become a soldier with a lifetime duty to fight for Shan liberation from the Burmese. Sang Lot's life is, like that of many others, determined by war, the rise of nationalism, ethnocentrism, and abstract borders. He lives without papers in a vacuum between 2 countries, a liminal state where one remains in suspension. I shall say that we had a hard time choosing the contributions for this weekend in particular. This is because there's a veritable wave of extremely convincing, often epic work by artists working in different media and genres produced in the region we are devoting ourselves to in this project. Artworks that are dealing with the lived experiences and haunted existences in relation to the narrative and imaginary of modernity's frontiers, and that confront, in particular, colonial, imperial, and state violence. I like to think of many of them as engaging in a kind of frontier realism. Even if we are no fans of such labels, I think this concept of a frontier realism can help us see a common concern implicit in these works and in their aesthetics and modes of storytelling. I want to take them seriously as contributions to what we can call, with James Scott, anarchist historiographies, which are not subjected to the molds of national identities, and hence make other subjectivities thinkable, perhaps possible, breaking through the disillusioned present by reconceiving the relation of the past to the present. The common concerns in these works, I believe, is the search for a form of collectivity, for a subterranean shared memory and common imaginary, which does not subsume differences but resists the boundary-making practices, the divisions inflicted by imperial and colonial schemes and the nation-state in their wake. This shared dimension is to be unearthed at the frontier, through an analysis of the frontier and its mediums. Most schematically, a frontier is a zone of confrontation and uncertainty, where one form of order meets another, often imagined in binary terms as order meeting disorder or chaos. It is not a naturalized border between sovereign entities that have more or less symmetric relations. Rather, it is a zone characterized by asymmetries, for instance, and perhaps typically so, between state and non-state actors. Anna Tsing calls these frontiers zones of simultaneous mapping and unmapping. My central and not the least original thesis here today is, however, that the frontier is not merely some remote limit, some disorderly borderland at the margins of order or the law, but that it structures the imaginary and the symbolic within the present order alike. Every picture and every linguistic argument we make beneath the surface partakes in its logic. In a very fundamental sense, then, the frontier is also the limit of common sense, and perhaps of sense as such. The frontier opens to what Michael Tausig has called a death space of signification, a space of inversions and often outright travesty and arbitrariness. And the frontier also activates the senses, is the place of extreme sensations and generally of deranged categories and unruly mediations, a place of violent enactions of divisions that are equally at all times held in suspense. It is to these moments of suspense, as they are dramatized in a few artworks, that the examples I show here today are devoted. The experience of the frontier is always radically out of sync with the image produced by civilizational discourse and its ideological superstructure. This is one of the central themes of James Scott's seminal study, The Art of Not Being Governed, an Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia. Scott's survey is written in the tradition of anarchist historiography, and as such presents a challenge to the genre of historical narrative as such, to the way in which historical narratives enact the logic of imperial and state-making projects. In the lineage of Pierre Clastres' seminal work, Societies Without a State, The Art of Not Being Governed is an archaeology of an ancient conflict, which puts the critique of colonialism into a wider perspective, one necessitated by the grand enclosure of the present day, the grand enclosure of globalized capitalism and the Anthropocene. This is the conflict between bureaucratic empires based on fixed-field agriculture and grain production with nomadic or semi-nomadic forms of subsistence and autonomy. The history of this ancient conflict, of this ancient frontier, flashes up today in the moment of danger that is the ecological and political crisis of the Anthropocene. Indeed, this conflict characterizes almost the entire period known as the Holocene. This period, the Holocene, this epoch, this geological epoch, roughly simultaneous, the same period as the beginning of the Neolithic, seems to be determined to an overwhelming degree by a particular dialectics evolving around a bifurcation that determines the matrix of discourse of possible narratives. It is the bifurcation instantiated by sedentary culture based on cultivation and the culture of typically non-state people engaged in foraging or shifting cultivation, which later transforms into the binary of state and non-state, civilization and its others. It is the very conflict that is also at the heart of the Bible, among other narratives to be found there, of course. This is also a story of the nomadic Semitic inhabitants of the southern Arabian Peninsula who were conquered by the farmers inhabiting the northern Fertile Crescent. This conflict between expansionist farmers who segment the territory and semi-nomadic herders is reflected in the emblematic figures of Abel and Cain. Anarchist historiographies such as Clastres or James Scott's oppose and expose the bias and power structures at work in history written with capital H. They are histories written from the perspective of what such civilizational discourses foreclose, histories that do not reinforce the bifurcation, but instead engage in its dialectics, countering the phantasmatic dimension of such discourse by exposing the frontier as a complex process of mediation. No such thing as a Thai civilization or a Chinese culture, to use two examples from The Art of Not Being Governed, are taken for granted in such an analysis. Rather, these works engage with the construction of such identities from an analytical vantage point, from where they are not taken as a given, but appear as products of practices of division and of the forms of mediation that these practices authorize and foreclose alike. In The Art of Not Being Governed, the story that is told revolves around the highlands traversing at least 5 Southeast Asian nations: Thailand, Burma, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, as well as much of southern China, a vast territory with over 1 million minority inhabitants of great diversity that has for centuries served as a refuge from conscription into imperial and state rule and their respective civilizing missions. This designated geography has earned itself also the name zomia, about which we will learn a little bit more later. There's a vast amount of writings, materials, and increasingly of artworks that one could use to circumscribe and ever expand the geography of Zomia. Initially, we wanted to organize an exhibition under this heading, an exhibition devoted to the artful historiographies of various genres in what I just suggested could be called frontier realism. An exhibition that would disclose a radically different geography in a region that is today characterized by intensified onslaught of renewed imperial aspiration, resource extraction, and the advance of industrial agriculture into the remaining forest and its indigenous populations. But as James Scott notes himself at the outset in his book, while vast areas of Zomia today are still contested frontiers, often characterized by resistance and violence, Zomia is to a certain degree a thing of the past. Imperial and state control now profess over technological and infrastructural means that have made it possible to extend control into the very zones whose terrain has previously made it impenetrable. Historically and on a global scale today, the dawn of aircraft technology, for instance, stands for this ability of states to act at a distance. Hence, perhaps, the presence of drone warfare, as Eyal Weizmann has shown in his work on the aridity line, on the line that separates cultivatable land all around the world, more or less, at least stretching from West Africa to the Gobi Desert, and cultivatable land from the desert. And in most of these areas today, you have exactly the presence of drone warfare. So we decided not to do an exhibition on the art of not being governed in Zomia. We also saw artistically, perhaps more than intellectually, a certain danger for falling for a romanticism for non-state spaces that at times could also be seen as playing out politically reactionary, or finding itself at least in uncomfortable neighborhoods, let's say, with certain non-state or anti-state ideologies from another West Coast. So our central question was then, what has happened to these frontiers? How do we locate them in the present within this vast, internally fractured, though, enclosure that is the Anthropocene? Where is the frontier today then, was our question. The answer, in short, it has become a planetary envelope. To break through its grip on the imaginary and imagine a different reality, one different from the violent exterminism, subjugation, and resource extraction that characterizes this envelope. It is necessary, we believe, to locate its workings in aesthetics and dominant media technologies as well. The central piece of the exhibition, 2 or 3 Tigers, One or Several Tigers by Ho Tzu Nyen, I believe, does just that. What appears at first as a delirious mythical narrative, as a Gothic opera, perhaps even exoticist, is upon a second gaze just that, an attempt of what Etienne Turpin, in his contribution to our collection of texts that we have online as the 2 or 3 Tigers journal, calls the necessity to historicize the human architectures of enclosure. So my next excerpt, which is 8 minutes long, is from Ho Tzu Nyen's One or Several Tigers. And the quality here in this screening doesn't do justice to the work, so I encourage everyone who hasn't seen it yet to go see it in its setting in the exhibition hall.
Time stands still, and in the flash of this encounter, it's me more than the other, one tiger becomes another.
The flash of this encounter transports us back in time to that day in 1835 in the forested heart of Singapore, when George Drumgold Coleman, government superintendent of the public works in Singapore, surveyor of the station, came face to face with the tiger. The clamour of this clash makes it easy to overlook the rest of the image. Coleman was also the superintendent of convicts in Singapore. He dealt with Indian felons sentenced to prison terms in British possessions outside India, where they served as a source of indentured, low-cost labour, the English substitute for slavery. Employed in public works, they drained marshes, built roads, and assisted in surveys where they sometimes encountered the tiger. Not only did they build the churches and the civic buildings that Coleman designed, but when brick prices soared in 1844, the prisoners made the very bricks with which they would build these buildings. In 1860s, the prisoners were assigned to a building which in its final stages resembled a prison, upon which the prisoners realized that they were building their future jail, and then they all sang. Prisoners, this sentence was a journey of no return, a voyage across the Kalapani, the black waters, in which the form of one's former life was dissolved like water in water, like water. Prison administrators mixed prisoners of all castes together. A cynical belief that one caste would invariably betray another. For the prisoners, this constant caste defilement meant perpetual excommunication from their kin. The complete dissolution of life as lived, like water, in water, water, in water,
So this is a rather brutal in and out of a piece that, of course, has a longer narrative arch. I hope Sunyan forgives me for this brutality. So what you see here on the screen, on the left side in the original, on the right side in its computer-generated animation version, is what gives this whole work, is the picture that gives this whole work its initial cue that becomes sort of its cosmographic primal scene. This lithograph shows George Drumgold Coleman, land surveyor for Singapore for the British in the 1830s. And as it's just narrated in the piece, in the excerpt you've seen, he was also in charge of the island's convict workforce. The theodolite, the image that you, the machine, the instrument that you see here in the center, that is the target of the tiger's attack, serves here perhaps as somehow an allegory of what is to come, the arrival of a vast web of mathematical operations and bureaucratic procedures, which we can say by now from that primal scene onward, and its many different instantiations and chronologies, of course, has been growing exponentially and has culminated in the information technologies we use today. At the time of George Coleman, though, this grid was virtually identical with empire. Yet the imperial frontier was still earthbound and linear, geared towards a horizon, enclosed by an outside that was unknown. The web initially woven by the theodolite has since then been extended to become what I've earlier called a planetary envelope, perhaps best exemplified by the thousands of satellites that map and orbit the planet Earth. It is into this planetary orbit that Hutsunyan has displaced the figures from the lithograph, George Coleman, the tiger, and the theodolite, except the convicts and the initial backdrop, the jungle. These figures float displaced within space like a celestial constellation, eternally held in suspense. This initial frontier encounter becomes the foundational moment for a new cosmology. As if unchained from Earth, plunging backward, sideways, forward, in the cold light of undead time, the synthetic spectral bodies of human-animal and human-animal hybrid have been literally ungrounded. This is mostly the part that we have not seen, that precedes the excerpt we have seen. Perhaps they can be seen as echoing Nietzsche's madman who shudders with his lantern, confronted with the modern abyss, allegorized by the breath of empty space. Zunyan thus exposes and makes thematic the genre of cinematic animation and the status of CGI imagery, computer-generated imagery in particular, suggesting that it might serve as an allegory of our present cultural imaginary of the planetary technological condition. The groundless ontology of that cosmos, however, is haunted. And while haunting might symbolize the porosity of ontological divisions between life and death, past and present, it also typically holds reality hostage as if under a spell. Animation is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it suggests an ontological omnipotence. An entity can assume any form, can transgress any boundary. Even death in animation is reversible. On the other hand, this limitless possibility is bounded by impossibility. Invention is frequently jeopardized by the reification of normative schemes of perception managed within the matrix of the colonial imaginary and its fantasies of wilderness, metamorphosis, and the collapse of ordinary knowledge and its binaries. Must we hence imagine cinematic animation not only in the modern analogy to a pre-modern magic and enchanted world, but as its symptomatic displacement? Could we imagine the technology of animation to be a product of the spell cast by the theodolite? The animated image is the product of the frontier dialectics of capitalist modernity. The technology to produce the illusion of movement is the result of the rationalization of movement and of bodily gestures for factory work. In CGI, this dialectics underlying modern animation is pushed to new heights. CGI is no longer a representation that exists in whatever friction with what it represents. Rather, it is a data map. Animation is thus a counter gesture or a line of flight from the fixating grid. Is thus no longer a counter gesture or line of flight from the fixating grid, but rendered through its finest possible resolution. The growing leaves of a tree, for instance, are nowadays produced by generative algorithms modeling evolution itself. There is, figuratively speaking, no longer a tiger that attacks the theodolite as its antithesis. Rather, it is the theodolite itself that assembles or conjures up the phantasmagoric likeness of the tiger from countless data points. The difference is not merely between abstraction and flesh, between safe distance and threatening proximity, eye-level encounter, such as in this scene, or action at a distance, but the very dichotomies collapse that are dramatized in the picture of that tiger attack. If the animated image once was seen as reviving a foreclosed animism within modernity, then today it speaks to a different condition, that of a universalized Cartesian envelope, acting as the infrastructure of capitalism's fantasy of a dematerial universal mediality, achieved through digital code and its union with the medium of money. CGI might then be symptomatic of a permanently reconfiguring, meaning shape-shifting, capitalism that does not know how to die. One or several tigers is a reflection on the technological extension of the modern colonial enclosure into the realm of media technologies. It is an enclosure of mediumistic phenomena as such, of the mediumistic capacities of human subjects and the body politic. Today, technological applications have come to naturalize and fixate ontological templates derived from the colonial frontiers. Zunyan's work underlies that magic and technology, to use the words of Walter Benjamin, have to be seen as historical variables. Zunyan's delirious narrative is equivalent to a dream dreamt for the purposes of rendering a history of segregation and enclosure collective again. In the work, the tiger symbol moves from being a mediator of the ancestor world to symbolizing both the threat of chaos and domination to impersonating imperialist and capitalist predation. In the second part of One or Several Tigers, this dialectics is further enhanced. Zunyan does so by turning to the group of convicts, what we have just seen, that surround Coleman, the surveyor, during his triangulation of the land. While we listen to Ho telling us the story of Indian convicts in Singapore being charged with building their own prison, where eventually they would become each other's wardens and where surveillance was gradually replaced by self-surveillance, we watch real actors impersonating the convicts surrounding Coleman. That's the scene that follows what I have been showing you. And what we have seen is their bodily gestures being motion captured and scanned for 3D CGI rendering by a total of 82 cameras. The situation depicted in this image is an inversion of what, to come back to Benjamin one more time, Benjamin said with regard to early photography and moving images, namely that they restored gesture to the human technology of recording experience. Now these gestures, these bodies, feed machines to lend them a human face. Thus, the ghostly labor on which Singapore and colonial modernity at large has been built makes its appearance. The laborers depicted in the lithograph were convicted felons, as we heard, from India under British rule. They referred to these journeys, as we have heard, the journeys overseas, as a voyage through black waters, gradually dissolving their identity and destroying the past life like water in water. The motive of crossing and shape-shifting in this frontier space, mirrored by the relation between the mythical were-tiger and the medium of animation, hence gets another turn here. What the suspense in space was for the CGI animation of Coleman and the tiger is now mapped onto colonial history and the passage across the ocean, allegorizing the process of displacement and identity dissolution, the effacement of difference and of history. This dissolution of identity is at once an irretrievable loss and a potential, as water can stand for a zone of becomings, a medium of unruly mediations, or, alternatively, for the subsumption of everything under modernity's master medium, capital. The tipping of the dialectic hinges on that difference between different medialities, like water or water, a difference under threat of collapsing once and for all, just as the memory of the past. And such a moment of danger was the encounter between Coleman and the tiger, a flashing up of danger. Zunyan projected them into cosmic space, mirroring capital's dream of overcoming the bounds of matter. Water in water stands for a vanishing difference between techno-capitalism's fantasy of a universal mediality and the search for different forms of global commonality in the ruins of imperial history. Thank you very much.